I'm the director of the Brazil Institute here at the Wilson Center, and it's a pleasure to have you here with us today and to welcome Dr. Jonathan Foley, Executive Director of the California Academy of Sciences, with Thomas Lovejoy, who is a founding member of the Brazil Institute Advisory Board. He's with the United Nations Foundation, and our dear colleague Roger Mark de Souza, the director of the Population, Environment, Security, and Resilience Program here at the center. This series started in 2011. It's a series that the Brazil Institute, the Environmental Change and Security Program, and George Mason University, where Tom Lovejoy is a professor. We do this together, and it bases on the premise that impacts of humanity on the environment, including natural resources, are planetary in scale, and this series addresses planetary-scale problems and solutions. I will be very brief for a couple of reasons that I will explain, but I will ask soon Thomas Lovejoy to come to the podium to introduce properly Dr. Foley to you, and then Roger Mark will take over and manage the discussion after Dr. Foley's presentation. This is a very timely event for us. Climate change has been at the center at this series, Managing Our Planet, at the center, obviously, of the Environmental Studies program here, at the center of the Brazil Institute's program. Next Tuesday, and you are all invited, we will host here an event on collaborative research done by American and Brazilian scientists since the beginning of this year, under the leadership of the Department of Energy of the United States and the São Paulo Science Foundation, FAPESP. We have an all-day event which will be open by the Secretary of Energy, Ernest Muniz. It deals with the research focus on the threats to the hydrological equilibrium of the Amazon region. It's a collaborative research that has started in January. Preliminary findings will be presented here on Tuesday, and then the scientists from Brazil, from the United States, will continue the conversation in a by invitation only basis the following day. Also, I wanted to share with you that in the month of November, we will be in California with FAPESP doing the 4th edition, what we call FAPESP Week, where we organize symposia between Brazilian and American scientists working together in specific items, in specific projects. We will be at University of California, Berkeley on the 17th and 18th of November, and then we will go to Davis, UC Davis, on the 20th and 21st, but on the 19th, we'll have the privilege to, and FAPESP, led by its president, Celso Laffer, and by its scientific director, Dr. Brito Cruz, will have the pleasure to visit the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco. With that, I would like, I have to go to a meeting of all themes on energy that we are planning, a major conference on energy, trying to evaluate what will be the impact on climate change and of falling prices of oil all over the world when we are planning something major in that regard. So I have to join that conversation downstairs, but I would like to thank you again, Dr. Foley, for having joined us here, and our colleagues, but we invite Tom Lovejoy to come to the podium and start us off. Thank you.
So you actually have biographical material for John Foley. So I'm not going to go into all that detail. He is the newly minted executive director of the California Academy of Sciences, and he has a long and distinguished history, despite his young age, in exactly the subject matter that he is going to address this afternoon. It's basically the Gordian knot of food production, protecting biological diversity, distorted carbon cycles, and nitrogen cycles, and how we work ourselves to a better future than some of the trajectories might lead us to think we're going to get to. I've wanted John to be part of the Managing Our Planet series for some time. I've been talking about it for at least a year and a half, and we had the great good fortune that in fact he was going to be in town, and he was able to stay long enough to do this. So John, thank you so very much.
Great. Well, thank you, Tom, for the invitation and the kind words about not so young anymore. But it's all, well, okay. But, anyway, thanks so much for having me here today. And I know we're going to have more of a kind of a conversation and panel format later, which will probably be a lot more exciting. But I was asked to kind of kick off some of our thinking collectively today about this, and well, kind of said, Gordian knot around food and environment and security issues. And I can't possibly cover all of that in just a few minutes, but I'll try to at least entertain some of the beginning points where we may begin our conversation today. So one of the things that's really unique about this time in history is that, we've really begun to exhaust our planet. For most of our existence on the world, we've been very small, and the Earth was relatively large. We had essentially infinite resources relative to the size of our society. But that's certainly not the case any longer. We are now beginning to exhaust much of our planetary resources because of basically two facts. One is we're a lot bigger as a species. We've got a lot more people on planet Earth right now than we've ever had before. Something north of 7 billion, possibly heading towards 9 to 10 billion by the middle of this century. So certainly population growth has been a big factor in this pressure on our planet. But also, and maybe more importantly, is the use of resources, our technology, and our economy. This picture is what Earth looks like at night from outer space. And it shows quite dramatically the impact of technology, energy use, and urbanization, and reshaping the character of our planet in many, many significant ways. I think the important point, though, here is that we're living in a time of unprecedented change. Just in the last 50 years, our population itself has more than doubled in size. The economy grew about sevenfold during the same time. And the combination of those two, increasing standards of living and consumption, plus the number of people, has led to about a tripling of global food consumption and water consumption, and a quadrupling of fossil fuel combustion. So, whether we like it or not, we're living in the time that's changed more, not only than any other time in history, it changed more than all of human history put together just happened during our lifetime. So that's a very interesting moment to be alive, and a particularly challenging one, because this is really the inflection point of our history on this planet. So what has that got to do with all of this? Well, it has to do with the human condition and the environment in two ways. In one way, humanity is in many ways much better off than we've been in the past. I think in every material measure, at least in the aggregate, humans are living longer, better lives with more nutrition, better medical care, more democracy, and more literacy and more freedom than any previous generation. Certainly we have a long way to go towards perfection, that's certain, but we've made some tremendous progress on the human side of the equation. But the environmental side of the equation is perhaps not so good. At the local scale, we've certainly cleaned up pollution in the West, but in many global situations and in many developing countries, the environmental picture is looking quite grim. This is essentially because we're running out of planet. We are exhausting so many primary resources and the underlying kind of ecological systems that maintain them that we're really in great peril right now. One of those systems we've been exhausting, of course, is the human land base that is mainly used for agriculture around the world. So is there any way to, perhaps the lights would be okay. I'm wondering if there's a way to dim them a bit, but maybe there's not. Well, trust me, there was a rainforest in that picture that was burned down. Maybe it's appropriate you can't see it. So this is a picture of something that's not there anymore anyway, so it's probably fine. But the point here is that we are clearing so much land now, mainly to grow food. This picture here is a picture from research in my lab has been doing over the years, kind of tracking agricultural land all over the planet. And what it shows you is that now agriculture is by far the biggest thing we do in the world in terms of land area. All of the greenish tinted color areas here are areas we use to grow crops, mainly things like wheat and rice and sorghum and millet and, I don't know, carrots and cassava, whatever you like. All the brown areas you can see is actually the world's largest ecosystem, which is pastures and rangeland. That's the area we use to grow cattle. So this is an extraordinary amount of land. In fact, right now, it's about 30 to 35%, maybe even 40% of all the land on Earth is used to do one basic thing, that is to grow food. So to basically first approximation, all land on Earth that's being used by people is used to grow food. By comparison, about 1% of the Earth's land surface is in cities and suburbs today. But yet half of us live there. But 40% of the Earth's land is used to grow food. So that's a pretty astonishing fact. We have much more land in agriculture than we do in people around the world. We also use an enormous amount of water around planet Earth. And I now live in California, where we're experiencing a tremendous drought that is kind of unprecedented on the historical timescales. And that puts tremendous pressure on water resources, which are, again, primarily used for growing food. This picture is a case in point. This is a picture flying into Phoenix, looking out the airplane window and seeing iceberg lettuce being grown in the desert, being irrigated with perhaps the most inefficient kind of irrigation humanity's ever invented. So we do that. We drain the Colorado River most years to do things like this. And we're now paying the price for it. And I'll tell you more about this a little bit later. But right now, we're probably consuming, if you read Sandra Postel and Peter Glick and others, probably about half of what we might consider the renewable freshwater resource base on the planet. That is water that's flowing across the Earth's surface every year. How much could we use? Well, on average, we use about half of that. And we use most of it for growing food. It turns out 70% of what we call water withdrawals, it is water you take out of nature, like through pumping it from a lake or reservoir or groundwater, is used to irrigate crops. But it's 90% of what we call consumptive use of water. That is water that's used and then not returned back to its watershed of origin. It's instead going to the atmosphere. So this is a really big deal. So again, to first order, all of the water used in the world, to first approximation, is used to grow food. Everything else is secondary. So not only is agriculture the biggest use of land, it's the biggest use of water, it's also one of the big contributors to the issue that all of us care about is climate change. We normally think of climate change as basically an energy problem, but that's actually kind of deceptive. It's not exactly. About 60% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from the burning of fossil fuels. And yeah, 60% is the majority, but a big share of them, something like 30% of all of the emissions of greenhouse gases, actually come from agriculture. And it turns out if you break it down by economic sector, agriculture with its 30% is by far the biggest part of the economy contributing to greenhouse gases. The second largest would be all of the world's transportation, which totals about 15%. So if you want to tackle economic sectors that contribute to climate change, you would have to start every single time with agriculture first, and then things like transportation, electricity, heating and cooling, manufacturing, and so on are actually distant seconds, thirds, and fourths. So again, once again, agriculture is probably one of the dominant things we do in the planet, whether it's land, water, or atmosphere. So it's crucially important. And so at this point in history, it's pretty clear, I think, that we're hitting many of the limits of what our planet can do in terms of its natural resources without causing degradation, at least. How long we can do that, can we sustain that, that's still a question. But for now, we are certainly bumping into the limits of what our planet can comfortably do to sustain the human enterprise. We're seeing that quite plainly. And I think the point I hope I'm making is that agriculture is by far the biggest thing we're doing to the planet, whether it's biodiversity, habitat, land and water quality, even climate change. It turns out agriculture is the elephant in the room almost every single time. So that's a big challenge. How do we deal with agriculture and the environment? And it's more than an environmental problem, of course, because we're talking about food. We're talking about agriculture, something that is crucial to human sustenance, human security, human well-being, and the human economy. So this isn't an optional activity. Feeding the world is not optional. But neither is sustaining our planet. So we have kind of a real quagmire here. It's not just an environmental problem, it's kind of a civilization problem. Like, do you get to have one? If we can't feed ourselves without destroying our planet in the long run, then we're essentially done. So we have to find ways that can achieve both goals of nourishing our planet, providing its economic and material well-being right now, but also sustaining those underlying ecosystem properties we need for future generations to thrive as well. And so that's kind of the dilemma that we're seeing here. The dilemma is, how do we answer two questions, not just one? One is, how do we feed a rapidly growing world and do that equitably and securely and humanely in a way that's good for all of us, we hope? And secondly, how do we do that while still sustaining the planet we depend on? I think it's best to perhaps break that up into three parts to make it a little bit more tractable. I mean, this is a big problem. But if we break it into three little maybe sub-questions, maybe we can wrap our heads around it. One, of course, is, can we meet the demands of people right now? There are over 7 billion people in the world, and roughly 850, close to 1 billion of us do not have food security today. Not because we don't have the food in the world, not that we don't grow this food, but because about 1 billion people, a little less, don't have the economic or institutional political means to get it. They're too poor, they're too disenfranchised, they're too disconnected from the world affairs to exercise power to get this food, and so they are food secure. Essentially, it's a problem of poverty in institutions, not one of agronomy. But in the future, we have the demands of food increasing with ever-growing population growth. As we add 2 billion more people to the planet, that will add pressure to the food system. But more importantly than that, more importantly in the population, is dietary change. 2 billion people coming to the population is one issue. That's about a 30% increase in food demand, let's say. But if we also look at the increasing wealth of the world, especially the 4 billion people in the world who are now building a global middle class, people in China, in India, Indonesia, Vietnam, etc. These people are joining a new global middle class that we never had before now, and are basically changing their diets rapidly and in massive numbers, and adopting more of a Western style of diet. So that means eating more meats, more dairy products, more sugars, fats, oils, and other very resource-intensive foodstuffs. So yes, population growth is part of the issue, but more importantly is the consumption issue about how diets will change with increasing affluence. If you do the math on this based on just the current trajectories we're on, assuming we don't change anything, which is always a bad assumption, but if we assume nothing were to change and population growth and dietary affluence continue to grow in the future, we would have to roughly double the world's food supply to keep up with that by 2050. I'll show you in a minute, that's not going to be possible. So we're going to have to find other ways to meet that, probably by not meeting that. And that might mean changing the demand itself, not just trying to meet that demand. Finally, the question of how do we make agriculture truly sustainable? As I've shown you, agriculture is having huge impacts on land, water, atmosphere, biodiversity, etc. So this challenge of feeding the world today, feeding it in the future as demand explodes in the coming decades, and making this truly sustainable. And a fourth issue I'm sure we'll discuss later in person on the panel, and I'm not going to talk about so much, is and doing that on a changing planet, where climate change is beginning to rear its head more and more every day in a way that we don't fully understand completely in terms of its impacts on agriculture and food security. So this is a very big challenge. We have to solve multiple problems that sometimes have competing interest, and we have to solve them simultaneously at the same time at our first try. We're going to get one try at this, and we have to get it right. So that's a really big challenge. Right now, how are we doing so far in addressing that challenge? Well, in a word, bad. Not as well as we should be. One of the things we've been depending on so much is that the green revolution of the last 3-4 decades or so has been tremendously useful in giving us tools that have boosted yields, at least in the short run, through better breeding, use of more nitrogen fertilizers, using machinery, using pesticides, herbicides, and so on. So yes, we got a good boost in yields. We also had a tremendous degradation of the environment in some ways that went along with that, and that debate about the trade-off of those two continues to this day. But one of the things that is we maybe should have expected, but many people didn't, is the green revolution is probably over for the most part. In fact, in most of our most important crops, the ones that feed most of the world, like rice and wheat, are the pillars of food security in the world today. Rice and wheat together, just as two crops, provide about half of the calories of the human diet on this planet every day. Everything else we eat are the other half. So if you really care about food security, rice and wheat are where you probably want to start, and especially rice. It turns out, again, I wish you could see this a little bit better. I'll try to walk you through this. I can see it better than you can, I guess. But over here in these kind of tan-colored areas through China, India, West Africa, and throughout, these are regions where rice yields have been stagnant, have been just dead flat for over a decade. Wheat has a similar map. Soybeans and corn, on the other hand, maize and soybeans are seeing good yield improvements pretty much everywhere, but those don't really feed the world. They feed mainly animals and cars. But wheat and rice generally don't. Those are for human consumption directly and are fed mostly to the middle and poorer economic strata of the world. So these are really crucial, and we're seeing massive yield stagnation on the order of like 30 to 40% of the acres of land growing rice and wheat are no longer improving their yield. That's extremely disturbing. And with maybe with future investments going back into agricultural research, perhaps we can get more yield gains. But at a certain point, we hit the limits of what biology can do practically in a farm, not in a laboratory. And maybe we have to look for other solutions. So I like to point out that, in energy strategy, we don't only think about production. Well, we shouldn't. I mean, people yell drill, baby, drill all the time. But we should be thinking about the whole energy system of production and consumption and looking how to balance the two. Same thing in agriculture. For 40 years, we've been kind of quietly saying to ourselves, grow, baby, grow, and not really looking at, well, what are you using the crops for and where are they going? Where are there ways to look at the demand side as well as the supply side of the food system? So instead of just thinking, how do we grow our way to success, maybe we have to think of other ways, because the ways we're going now, I think, are hitting the wall on what they can do for food security. We're not keeping up with growing food demands right now. That's certainly clear. We're not keeping pace with food security generally because of institutional and poverty issues. And what we're doing today is certainly not in the long run environmentally sustainable. So we're going to have to think of something new. And so I think it's time to look for new solutions that look at production opportunities and on the demand side and see how we can put those together. Over the last couple of years, I've been fortunate to work with a number of colleagues around the world on thinking about this problem, about how can we increase food availability while decreasing the environmental impact on the planet. And we came up with about 5 major starting points we published in Nature, and then most recently with National Geographic and a few other places. And these are just meant to be conversation starters. It's not the full list of all the things we could do, but these are 5 that might be a minimum subset that we should begin to pay attention to as we address this problem together. One of those would be to really focus on deforestation. Of all the things we do linked to agriculture and environment, this is perhaps the worst. We clear rainforests that are rich in biodiversity, that are rich in carbon, that have huge impacts on our water resources and climate all over the world. And we clear them. And we clear them not always to feed the poor, but often to feed the middle class and the rich. For example, growing things like oil palm or soybeans to feed to animals half a world away, or other kind of luxury crops. These are not food security crops. They're middle income kind of for global trade cash crops usually. So this trade-off between the world's richest ecosystems and kind of luxury goods or okay things for the middle class is a very poor trade-off in the long run. If this were truly needed for food security for the bottom billion of the world, that might be one thing, but it's not. And so this is a bad trade-off. Instead of clearing rainforest for food that we maybe don't want to grow in the first place, maybe we should look at the land we've already cleared, habitats that can't be further impacted, and ask how do we get more value out of those? We often have been focusing our investment at the kind of top of the pyramid of agricultural production, places, here like Iowa and maybe Western Europe, I should say, parts of China, where agricultural production is very high now. But we also need to be looking at the kind of base of the pyramid across Latin America, parts of Africa, even Eastern Europe, where yields are massively lower than they should be. These are some of the most fertile lands in the world, yet their yields are only about 20% to 30% of what their agronomic potential is right now, mainly due to mismanagement, land tenure issues, and so on. During the Soviet era, but even worse post-Soviet era, the yields actually dropped a bit after the dissolution of the USSR. So we have a lot of opportunities to kind of focus on base of the pyramid solutions to boost yields where they're already low, and often with very low-tech approaches, GMOs and other things not required here. Most of this is water and manure would help a lot. Very simple kind of smallholder approaches would be tremendously useful and might be good things to think about. So base of the pyramid solutions for food security. We also have to think very carefully about how we grow food in terms of efficiency. We use an enormous amount of water and chemicals to grow food. How do we get more food per unit of water or per unit of chemical use, and especially per unit of chemical pollution that might go along with that? One thing we've looked at very carefully is how irrigation is used around the world. What we find is that, well, let me put it this way. You can't really think, I've been teaching this stuff for years, and I've asked my students a long time now, could you invent a machine that is more efficient at wasting water than that? And no one has been able to do it yet. An open swimming pool couldn't evaporate water this fast. In fact, I mean, it's perfect. You want to put the water in little droplets, shoot it out at a 45-degree angle for a maximum trajectory in the air during the bright sunshine, during the day where it's not even cloudy. I mean, this is an evaporation machine, not an irrigation machine. It is. It's only by accident that some of that water enters the soil. And at least that's what I think it's designed to do. It's pretty good at that. But if you go to Israel, you'll find that they're using drip irrigation techniques, which are much better because the water goes into the soil right where the roots are, which is kind of where you want it in the first place, not up in the air. So we have a long way to go. If we follow our Israeli friends, perhaps we could do far better. In fact, what we're finding is that how much water it takes to grow one food calorie in Israel is about 100 times less than it is, let's say, in Pakistan or India. So the same amount of water can grow 100 times more food in Israel with the same kind of climate as it does in Pakistan, for example. So that's a response to water security that's really interesting and one that we may want to emulate around the world a bit more. So there are tenfold and hundredfold improvements in the efficiency of using water to irrigate crops around the world, which is the biggest use of water on Earth. In California, we certainly have a lot of room to go here too, but much of the world does. It's also true for nutrients, I should say, too, and fertilizer use and chemical use, even if short of going extremely into the organic and agroecological approaches, which I personally prefer, but there are a lot of midway places where at least reducing the use of fertilizers, maybe by a factor of 2, could still maintain high yields by being more precise in the timing and location of how we deploy chemical inputs to agriculture. So there's also maybe 100% improvements in things like runoff and so on that are totally possible with better technology and just a little bit more care to agricultural inputs. Finally, though, just to kind of wrap this up, another area we cannot avoid, in fact, this is where most of the answer will be, isn't on the yield side, but it's on the demand side. All the math points to this. All the numbers point that this is where the big opportunity space really is. It's around diets and biofuels. Those are touchy subjects. But food waste maybe isn't so much. Well, unless there's a lobbyist from like the Food Waste Association, is there one? I mean, is there anybody pro food waste? Okay, I figured in Washington there's got to be one, but I haven't met that lobbyist yet. So, but for diets and biofuels, well, that's tricky because there's a lot of societal interest here. But food waste, I think we can all agree, reducing food waste is probably not a bad idea. But diets and biofuels are important too because, because of physics. You can't convert plant material to animal material with 100% efficiency. Just cannot happen. So this is American agriculture, which is probably some of the most efficient in the world at converting grains into animal products. If we turn it into milk, we get about 40% of the calories that were in the corn and soybeans come out as milk. That's remarkably good, actually. Eggs, 22, pork and chicken and stuff like this, about 10%. Beef's more like 3. So for every 100 calories of corn that we could eat, you'll get about 3 on a plate of boneless beef. 3% efficiency. That's not good. If you're trying to feed the world, being 3% efficient at something probably isn't the best starting point. That doesn't mean cut this out altogether. I'm not suggesting that, but it's maybe looking at this whole spectrum of animal agriculture and asking what's the right mix, or could some of that beef be displaced onto things we couldn't have eaten, like grass, instead of corn and soybeans, which we humans can eat. So it's kind of a question of how we deploy animal agriculture, not turning it off altogether, that could get a lot of efficiency improvements here, especially at this end of the spectrum. And it's especially important because there are 2 fundamentally different worlds in agriculture on the planet right now. There's the green world here in Africa, through the Mediterranean countries like Italy and Portugal and Turkey, through the Middle East, through India, China, and so on. Also, interestingly, California, through much of Latin America. That's the world that feeds people. The crops that are grown there are fed directly to people. It's things like corn and soybeans are not there. It's more rice and wheat, fruits and vegetables, roots and tubers, things like that, that are people food. They end up in your plate as is. The red areas, though, including much of the American Middle West, a lot of Western Europe, and some parts of Brazil and Argentina, are growing mainly a mixture of people food, but mostly animal and biofuel feedstocks. So in like Minnesota, where I used to live until very recently, 87% of the farmland in Minnesota is growing something for non-human consumption, mainly animal feed. Now, we do eat the animals later, but sometimes with 10% efficiency. So that's a big opportunity. All those red places are producing food at probably 10% to 5% the efficiency of all the places that are green. So that's a huge opportunity. In fact, the United States, we could feed about 20 people per hectare of farmland. We actually feed about 5 in our agriculture, which is about the same as Bangladesh does today. They grow a lot less, but they feed a lot more with it than we do. So it's not just what you grow, it's what you grow and how it's eaten and what happens later in the food system. Yields are not enough. We shouldn't just be measuring bushels per acre. We should be measuring mouths fed per acre. And that's probably a more important metric. And that doesn't make American agriculture look very good sometimes. So 55% of what we grow in the world is consumed as food, about 45% is not. That's pretty interesting. And in addition to that, beyond that biofuels and meat kind of discussion, which I know is controversial, but we can probably talk about it some more. In addition to that, whether it's plant-based or animal-based agriculture, an additional 30 to 40% at a minimum of food is wasted in the world. In rich countries, it's often wasted near the consumer, in our refrigerators, restaurants, and cafeterias, and so on. But in poor countries, it's also a similar number, about 30 to 40%. It's stubbornly high almost everywhere in the world, but it's often near the farmer. And it's where maybe the food didn't get to market because it rotted, spoiled, or got lost in transit somewhere along the way because of poor supply chains and poor infrastructure. So it's not only a loss of food, it's a double tragedy of loss of income as well to people who desperately need it. So that's the bottom line. If we can think about things like deforestation, growing food where we can, at the base of the pyramid, massive improvements in efficiency, rethinking diets, and rethinking food waste, we have about 5 levers. If we pulled in tandem together, we have a very good chance of actually pulling it off, that we could feed the world and sustain the planet. If you do at least those 5 things, and hopefully more, we can actually address this problem, but there's no silver bullet. There may be a lot of silver buckshot here, but there's no silver bullet at all in this problem. It's very complicated. But the good news is solutions certainly do exist. A lot of them are getting action now, which is excellent. A lot of them need a lot more attention. That's very good too. The hardest thing, though, of course, is not only we have to change agriculture, we have to do the hardest thing of all, is change how we think about agriculture and how we subsidize it, how we fund it, how we think about it in our economic and political systems, and how we value this whole system and what it produces. That may be the most difficult change, is the social and political one, not the technological. So that's what we have to do, figure out how to produce more with less. Instead of grow, baby, grow, it's grow more with less. And also use what we already have better. Those are the 2 new memes we have to have in agriculture to really be successful in moving this forward. So with that, I guess I'll end on a more optimistic note of saying, actually there's a lot of reasons to be very optimistic about this problem. We've identified it. We do seem to know what the problem is. We identified that there are solutions out there that can be taken to scale. There are huge economic and political obstacles, but there are no biological or physical ones to doing this. It's really in the social side of the equation, which is always the most stubborn, but the one that we can perhaps really work on together in the coming years. And I think we have the tools we need to solve this problem. We just have to make a choice now between the world we have today and the agriculture we've accepted versus the one we should have in the future as we move forward. So with that, I think I'll stop, and I think we'll shift to a quick discussion or panel questions with Tom. So thank you very much.
So John has given us his very well thought out and compelling analysis of where we are and ways we might get out of it. And there's some interesting things I always think about when I hear this. In the matter of food waste, during the Second World War, when this country went to victory gardens because so many of our agricultural producers were overseas in the conflict. In the United Kingdom, the food waste problem was considered so serious that Charles Elton, who wrote the first animal textbook, first textbook on animal ecology in 1927, and studied cycles of rodents like lemmings, actually was put on rodent control for the duration of the war because of the amount of food that got lost in that particular kind of way. But that's just an interesting historical footnote. So as I listen to all of this, climate change comes in on top of all of it. So clearly we will need to be working very hard to limit the amount of climate change that actually does take place, because it will just make it harder and harder to manage our way out of the situation which we have had so clearly analyzed for us. One other thing that I would love to hear your thoughts on is the nitrogen cycle and what might be done in terms of reducing the amount of nitrogen that's used in fertilizer that actually doesn't get used in growing plants because it runs off and turns into aquatic dead zones and estuaries and coastal waters around the world, which I remember correctly have been doubling in number every decade for 4 decades. Not good either in terms of food production. So another thing that comes to mind here is going to be the competition with biofuels and the extent to which that actually makes a lot of sense to actually be using some of our land for that as opposed to maybe generating a lot of it through aquaculture of algae. And so that's a first series of things I'd love to hear John's thoughts about. And then I think it might be really interesting, we might even engage Melinda Kimball in the front row to think about how we actually move the global political system to move this forward. So if I could just drop those in your lap to start with.
Yeah, I had to write them down. It's like, oh, that's a lot. Well, okay, maybe kind of in order of some of the topics you mentioned. So food waste is the one that always pops out of every analysis you can possibly do on this thing. This has got to be the biggest opportunity. You know, we're eking out like, 0.5%, 1% yield improvements here and there. With at least outside the U.S. right now, we're very, very lucky if we have a year where there's a 1% improvement. But here's a place where 30, 40% opportunities of all of the food on the world exist still. That's a good day if you can close that gap. The stubborn question, though, is, how do you do it? There are some interesting at the national and kind of state level outliers. Like Hong Kong, for example, has basically run out of landfill space. So it's become a huge economic issue to deal with landfills from restaurants and hotels and things like this. So people are beginning to think very, very creatively about limiting food waste there in ways I think we could follow. Japan also seems to have lower food waste than most other nations, but also higher food safety outcomes than most other countries. So they're probably doing something really right. So I think I want to look at those as case studies. At the more prosaic level, I used to work at a university for many years, and one of the things we did by accident is our students told us, they made us sign like a sustainability pledge for the entire campus. And we every year had goals of reducing water and energy use. And so in the cafeterias for and this was a big university. It's the University of Minnesota, about 55,000 students there at the main Twin Cities campus alone. We have many more outside in other parts of the state. So it was a pretty big community, and we changed the way we were cleaning the cafeteria. So let's get rid of cafeteria trays, and thought that would save us energy and water by not having to clean the trays. So students had to carry their bowls and their plates one at a time. And they could go back for more. It was an all-you-can-eat kind of dorm cafeteria, like you probably all had in college. And what we noticed, though, much to everybody's surprise, is food waste dropped by about 50%. what they were throwing away at the end of the day dropped hugely by getting rid of the damn trays. It was astonishing because, you know, that old expression your mother used to tell you, like your eyes are bigger than your stomach? You take an 18-year-old who doesn't know how to cook, you throw them in a dorm, you know, they're going to load up on everything they can fit on the tray. But if you tell them, no, you have to go back for a second serving and you have to actually walk over there, they probably won't bother. So it's really kind of astonishing. I have a teenager at home, so I can imagine this. So this is was kind of an interesting thing, and that was our vendor was Airmark. You know, they also serve cafeterias in hospitals and universities, NGOs, government agencies, and things all over the country. What if Sodexo, Airmark, and all the other big vendors like that all did that? That could make a big dent right there. It's thinking at the it's pretty hard in our own individual lives to thinking about your refrigerator, but could we think at the scale of large institutions? What about those who serve in the food in the military installations, or hospitals, or VAs, or museums, or schools? That's a big deal. So could we make some metrics for that, for improving, say, government procurement in those areas? Would be a big first step. So that'd be one thing I'd think about. There are a lot of opportunities of food waste, certainly. You mentioned, let's skip into the nitrogen cycle. I didn't get to talk about that very much, but as you pointed out, we use far more fertilizer, which contains nitrogen, phosphorus, and a whole bunch of other elements. But N and P, nitrogen, phosphorus, are the big two that are causing problems in the environment. Nitrogen, when it gets into fresh water, is a problem for water pollution in some cases. But when it gets into the oceans, it can overstimulate the ocean's photosynthesis. And then those plants, those little phytoplankton, rot down in the lower water column at depth, and they suck all the oxygen out of the water, leaving behind a dead zone, or hypoxia region, we call it. That's true in the Gulf of Mexico, as one of the world's largest now, thanks to the runoff from the Mississippi River and all the agriculture in the Midwest. What's interesting is that we could cut the amount of nitrogen used in the world probably by about half without impacting yields at all. Nitrogen is kind of funny. It's like the Goldilocks story. Half of the world has too much nitrogen, mainly India, then China, then the United States, and fourth would probably be Western Europe, in that order. India and China by far pollute more nitrogen than anybody else. We're a distant third in the United States, but still more room to improve. And then Europe is probably pretty good. Interestingly, Brazil is probably the only country in the world. Brazil and Australia are probably the only countries in the world that get about the right amount of fertilizer for the yields they're getting out of their crops. They're about at the optimum, and they're the only two countries that defy this. So about half the world has too much nitrogen, and the other half, except Brazil and Argentina, and Australia, has too little. It's places like Eastern Europe, a lot of sub-Saharan Africa, places where nutrients are being leached out of the soil or harvested too much, and they're just nutrient poor, nutrient-starved places where both organic and maybe chemical fertilizers could make a tremendous difference. So that's where we have to rebalance, figure out how do we get more nutrients in the soil of some parts of the world, and how do we dump less that isn't needed on others. And actually, Brazil is probably the country I would argue is leading the world in this. Embrapa and the agricultural ministry there and the agricultural practices in Brazil are probably the most advanced in the world, I would argue, much more than ours in this regard. And then finally, I guess you're talking about biofuels. Well, that's another big issue. And biofuels now use between 6-7% of global crop production, perhaps, going into biofuels. Mostly the U.S. corn biofuel complex is one. Brazil, sugarcane ethanol is another. There are a few others using oil crops and other kind of alcohol crops around the world. But those are the big two. Sugarcane in Brazil, of course, is turning that into ethanol for crop production going to fuel is vastly more efficient in terms of the energy inputs versus energy outputs. It's much, it's what, 8-to-1, 10-to-1 now. And it's pretty advanced. So that's one ball of wax. And sugarcane are typically, while they do certainly have environmental impacts, are not pushing into the rainforest regions. So it may not be adding to that. The pressures on rainforest in the Amazon are mainly from soy and beef still. Probably not so much sugarcane. It's grown much to the south. So that may be one kind of kettle of fish, at least in the direct impacts. But corn in the U.S., as we know, makes less sense. I'll just be diplomatic and say that. In terms of the energy inputs, even the most optimistic scenarios are for every unit of energy you put into American farms, you might get, let's be generous, 1.4 units of energy out. It breaks even and maybe a little bit more, but it's not a huge win. It's not 5-to-1 or 10-to-1. So it's pretty marginal at best for producing energy, and many studies are questioning whether it has environmental impacts on air quality, really, when you include the air impacts from agriculture itself. and other kinds of things, let alone the impact it has directly on the environment and maybe indirectly by distorting corn prices in markets around the world, and what that might mean for food security and indirect land use change. That's still a big question. Exactly how big that is, but it's not zero. So lots of issues there.
Great. So there are a couple other topics that would be interesting to get into in the course of the afternoon. One is actually how to move towards a more sustainable diet, which in many senses is going back towards a diet that we used to have, 50, 60 years ago in this country. And the other really interesting question here is more geographically constrained, looking at sub-Saharan Africa, with 1 billion more people expected. A lot of small, inefficient farm production, but big agricultural interests moving in. And then if you would be so kind, I'd love to hear from you what your thoughts are about how do we actually move this agenda internationally. And we do have somebody who knows the UN system and how to move it when it is movable more than almost anybody I know, which is Melinda in the front row. So.
Well, I'll try to comment on the first two. Maybe the third could be more of a,
Yeah.
I don't know how you want it, maybe more of a discussion. Other folks in the audience more knowledgeable probably than anybody. Well, this question of what's a sustainable diet, I think that question is going to plague us for years, what exactly that is. Of course, we love fads too, the paleo diet, the this and that diet, the whatever diet. Been very hard, trying very hard to resist coming up with a Foley diet or something. Could sell a cookbook or go on Oprah or something and retire. That'd be cool, but I'm not going to. I'm not sure what a sustainable diet is because agriculture has never really been 100% sustainable. It's just less unsustainable. I mean, agriculture has always been kind of an extractive enterprise, unless you go back a really long time. But there's certainly shades of gray there that clearly one of the biggest ones is rethinking not whether to eat meat necessarily, though if you choose not to, that makes it a lot easier. But how you produce meat. If you're going to eat animal products, there are better and worse ways to produce it. I think that we can explore that spectrum a lot. So I would work on that primarily. Also, I think there's a lot of in supply chains. This isn't really at the end consumer on your dinner plate as much. Certainly how much meat and what kind and how it's grown is a big factor there. But another question is really in supply chains. When you're looking at the huge supply chains that multinationals work with all over the world, I've been asked many times to analyze these supply chains of saying, can you rank the sustainability of all of our growers? And every time you do, you find a lot of these 80-20 rules. You find like 80% of the problems of a supply chain are probably in about 20% or less. Maybe it's a 90-10 rule in your supply chain. So, there are some certain rules of thumb that you probably ought to be looking at, like, don't grow things on ancient aquifers. No matter how you do it, growing stuff from the Agabulla aquifer is inherently unsustainable from water. You can't fix that. That's geologic ancient water from the last ice age. It isn't coming back. You're mining your water bank account and there's no interest. It doesn't come back. So what are you going to do about that? You probably shouldn't grow ever, things from peatland soils and rainforests from Indonesia. Tearing down the richest carbon reserves on the planet to grow palm oil is just demonstrably insane from an environmental point of view. And yet we do that. But not all palm oil is bad. Some of it could be good. So I don't like these kind of binary rules to say, don't eat palm oil, don't eat meat, don't, well, like most scientists, I'll give you my pat answer of it depends. That's how science, and they never meet a one-handed scientist because they'll say on one hand is this, on the other there's that. Well, but the rule of thumb I think that would be worth applying is look at every supply chain and don't just try to do. A lot of companies are saying we're going to improve our supply chain and be green. I'm like, no, what you need to do is get rid of 10% of your supply chain, because that 10% is 90% of your problem. So actually just redlining areas saying don't grow stuff here. Period, or don't grow that here that way, rather than trying to do the gentle, let's improve everybody kind of approach. That's what I would really focus on is 80-20 rules, linked around where are deforestation hotspots, Where are there water exhaustion hotspots? Where are there dead zones? And what are the practices? And I swear, every time you look at those carefully, you'll find a 90-10 rule or an 80-20 rule, where most of the problems are among a few players, and you know where you can find out what they are, who they are, and what they're doing pretty easily. So that's something I think we need to look at, is not the blanket, but to look at the specific. And also move beyond kind of the feel good. I know we all want to feel like, eating arugula grown in my backyard is going to save the planet. I wish it did. That'd be great. I like to grow stuff like that. But it's not going to be that simple. It's rethinking supply chains and some economic models pretty carefully, and that's going to be tough. I don't know. Do you
Want to comment on Africa?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Second question about Africa. Well, again, there are probably many more experts in this room than I could ever be on that topic, so I'll maybe defer that to a larger discussion. But I think you indicated a good problem is Africa, one, is at a crossroads. There's no other way to say that. It's probably the last agricultural frontier where there are huge swaths of land that could be quite productive in terms of yields that are generally not, that are places where poverty and institutions are crushing problems today. And with, hundreds of millions of smallholders, many of them are women, many are girls. And so we have the additional dimension that I didn't present today of, what about smallholder communities, the social dynamics of the farmers and the farming community, how do they live and the lives they lead? That's a very interesting and difficult challenge. Most of the world has gone through a major agricultural transition that Africa will soon experience. People leaving rural communities, going to city. We did this in North America. How many of you are farmers? Right. How many of you have grandparents who were farmers? Do the math. What's that going to look like in Africa in the next 30 years? It's going to be very interesting, isn't it? And we're talking about displacing a huge number of people very rapidly if industrial agriculture and big ag moves in, which it did everywhere else in the world. It'd be a little bit naive to assume Africa won't see some of that. What's the opportunity space for those people? Well, when we did this through our generations, it happened more slowly, just as the Industrial Revolution was presenting opportunities for us in Europe and the West generally, in North America. What's the opportunity in Africa for urban people and migrants? It doesn't look very good. So I think that's the dilemma. It's not that this is unique. It's just it's happening now in a situation that can barely afford to handle that.
So, Melinda, would you be willing to be put on the spot to say a couple things about where the international system might be moved to deal with these issues? And,
We have a
and then
microphone coming
yeah.
your way.
And then we'll turn it over to Roger Mark to MC the rest.
So, first of all, thanks for a great presentation. I think, you've really kind of outlined and analyzed the challenges. Actually, I have to say, certainly FAO has totally bought into your vision. They are advocating it. I was just on their website, and they've got tons of materials looking at how we do this going forward and what are the barriers. And the barriers are governance and institutions. And that also, to some extent in Africa, gets to infrastructure. And I was looking at the Sustainable Development Goals and how that's working out. I think those will be heavily shaped by the conference next month in Rome, the International Conference on Nutrition, the second one since 1992. And that conference has an opportunity to look at changes, knowledge, information, all this data we now have about how to do nutrition better, how to do agriculture better, and how to plan for a more sustainable future. I think the dilemma we face is it's not totally agreed even in developed societies, and developing countries have even more challenges. Although I'd certainly agree with the point about Brazil. Brazil is really taking this on and has really done some great work.
Great. So over to you, Roger.
Great. Thank you very much, Tom and John. That was excellent opening. John, I was wondering, as you look at how these issues are connected and you think about the policy and practical program implications, where are you finding where is the area that is most difficult? In what area we don't know what we don't know? What are we struggling with most that can provide some potential answers related to policies?
Well, I think this, you had the right, we just heard it. It was really, a lot of the issues are not, well, as I was trying to say before, I think we've one problem is in the kind of agronomic space, we've been focusing on one set of solutions too long. It's just, let's grow more. That isn't going to work indefinitely, and isn't. We think we're demonstrating that, and we have to think outside of that box, and that's difficult. We have to change the mindsets of that very dramatically. But then a lot of where the solution spaces are probably the reason we didn't want to go there is because they're trickier. They deal with governance, institutions, infrastructure, and other kinds of issues that are very thorny and don't have easy solutions, as we've been learning very painfully over the last decades. So I think that's where we're going to have to really focus, though, is on how do you improve smallholder agriculture at the base of the pyramid? What are the incentives for doing that? That are not the old models of foreign aid, but are really collaborative kinds of things. Maybe they're more south-to-south collaborations that we see Brazil doing again, leading the world in some of these things. It's also the public-private partnerships I think have been very exciting lately. At least in the West, we've seen some really good movements around certified, soy and palm and things like this. Well, especially soybeans and beef. Brazil, for example, this isn't just because they're hosting this thing. It really is a remarkable country in that not just being nice, it's just unbelievably good. I'm curious how many people knew this, that Brazil has seen about an 80%, let's say, drop in deforestation rate in the last 5 or 6 years. How many people knew that? Okay, this is a very well-informed audience. Okay, but even here, that'd be like every American car being taken off the road forever. That just happened in Brazil in the last few years. That's kind of amazing. It's the biggest win for climate change we've ever seen, ever. And yet, why can't we do more? And what happened was that agriculture, basically it stopped expanding into the frontier of the Amazon, and it started retreating and developing where it was and intensifying. Now, there are some other things that go along with that may not be perfect, but it's certainly a better trade-off than clear-cutting more rainforest, at least from the environmental point of view. Indonesia, though, where we need to focus more next, that's a whole different problem, not because the forests are all that different, though they are. It's because governance and institutions and transparency and law are totally different. And it's very, very hard to get that. And also the consumers of palm oil from Indonesia aren't Western firms that you can influence with Greenpeace activism or something. It's mainly China and India, who probably don't give a damn what Greenpeace thinks so much. So I think it's a little bit harder to influence those supply chains versus like a Cargill or a Bunge or whoever else is working with soybeans. So it's a very different dynamic, and it all comes down to governance and context. So it's not just agronomics. It's never a simple solution like that. The good news, though, I guess, is getting back to the 80-20 rule, though, I just want to focus on that a little bit more. That applies to individual farms and regions, but also applies to the entire globe. If you think about deforestation, for example, in the last decade, previous to the most recent one, we saw about half of the deforestation on the planet was occurring in Brazil and Indonesia. 2 countries had half of all that deforestation before Brazil changed its ways. That's amazing. And it went to mainly 4 commodities: beef and soybeans from Brazil, palm oil and timber from Indonesia. If you can solve half of a global problem by talking to 2 countries and 4 commodity supply chains, that's awesome. I mean, that is really great because it's concentrated in one economic sphere of influence. You can do something about that. It's not 7 billion people all doing a little bit. It's a few, a handful of companies controlled most of that. That's amazing. Jason Clay at WWF has become kind of a master of identifying those kind of supply chains that matter a lot. Same thing with water. It turns out India alone consumes half of the irrigation water on the planet. All by itself, half. Every other country in the world is the other half put together. That's astonishing. Most of that for wheat and rice. You add China and the US in there, you get about 80% of all the irrigation water on Earth. So you care about water and food, focus there, go to India. Help them with drip irrigation or something. That's a big deal. So again and again and again, whether it's nutrient pollution, water use, deforestation, you find there are hot spots on the planet. Kind of borrowing from our friends who work in biodiversity, there are places that just matter more than others, and that's where we should be focusing. And that matching governance tools to the kind of biophysical reality on the ground of like, here's the region that matters the most, so let's get policies and governance systems that focus on those in the public sphere, but I think increasingly in the private sector. Seeing what Unilever is doing, what Cargill is doing, what other companies are doing is pretty impressive. And they're less hobbled right now by, their legislative bodies, let's say. They don't have one, except for shareholders. So they can move nimbly, but they need to be guided by society.
Great, thank you. So I'd say let's open it up. My colleagues will come to you with a microphone. If you can identify yourself, your name and your affiliation. So let's start with the gentleman right here.
Hello, my name is Martin Apple. I'm affiliated with both the Council of Scientific Society Presidents and the University of California, Berkeley. I think most of us carry a mental model. The mental model is that we put all our received wisdom from science and everything we learn into a bucket. And then we pass the bucket around to those people we call the decision makers and the influencers, and we say, drink.
Yeah.
And what we're not doing is setting some kind of standards that say over the next 20 years, each year we have to show this amount of progress in this particular area in order to prevent the impending disasters which are clearly coming. So I think that's what we need as a framework that says, 2 years from now, 5 years from now, this is where we should be. And then the alarm bells should go off if we're not moving in those places. And clearly the one statement that has not been made that underlies all of this is it's an assumption that population will grow and therefore these demands will go. What if that assumption doesn't have to be correct? How could we work on making that also a primary goal of the next 20 years?
Okay, great. I think let's take a couple more. Yes, gentleman right here.
Hi, I have two big questions. First of all, is to do with phosphorus. According to the work of, I think, Dana Cordell at Link Hopping, she says that peak phosphorus is going to happen by 2030. Is that going to have a huge effect on is that going to sound alarm bells for us in terms of how we view food and fertilizer usage in those areas? And and considering that the next big sources of phosphorus would be bones, manure, guano.
Bat poop, yeah.
Yeah.
Bird poop, yeah.
Yeah. So are those realistic harvestable resources that we could potentially get? And the second question would be that given that the U.S. oil is in the golden age with the advention of shale oil and stuff and other unconventional resources, are biofuels really, really realistic, and are they going to be a continuous competitor for food resources in the future?
Thank you. Just remind me where you're from.
Eugene of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace.
Great. Thank you. Lady up front, and then we'll take those and then take some more.
My name is Iris Goodman. I'm with EPA, and Dr. Foley, I loved your presentation, and one thing that I think you do, probably you and all your colleagues, do better than anybody else, is do a spatial analysis and come up with numbers and dimensions and magnitudes that makes it very clear what the issues are. So I really think that is a tremendous talent and useful thing that you do. I'm wondering if you have if you've ever have thought to yourself, how could we put together a group of people that had the ability to change things, people in government, people in industry, and show them these very cogent maps and your 80-20 rules, and to be explicit, spatially explicit. Let's just, as a hypothetical, let's just rope off these areas according to your rules, and see how we could manage with food production by avoiding those areas. And so anyway, just what might you imagine could be a way to convene some real focused thought and dialogue on those topics?
Great, thank you. So let's take those. So, John, standards and sort of setting a framework, the assumption that population will not necessarily grow, phosphorus, oil and U.S. Biofuels, how realistic, and convening a group around spatial analysis to convince others.
Yeah, where do you want to start? Just anywhere?
Oh, you just
Pick one.
yeah, pick one.
Okay, well, do them in order. I jotted them down. Well, one question that a lot of people like to ask, I think it's a very important one to discuss, is getting to the population issue that you brought up over here. Well, yeah, so there's a certain amount of demographic inertia in populations because we don't instantaneously get born or die. There's always a lag. And in fact, half of the population growth in the world right now is not because there are more babies being born than 2, like 2.1 is the replacement fertility rate, but it's the fact that people are living longer than the previous generation too. And that's something you don't want to stop. So India, for example, has net population growth not because of births, but because of lower deaths. It's the first generation in Indian history that are living in their 70s. That's a good thing, actually. So that kind of takes the old equilibrium of people with large families but short lives and changes it to a new equilibrium of longer lives and smaller families, which is where the demographic transition ends up. And if you just work on the math of this, there is sort of an inevitability of some population growth of about 1.5 to 2 billion people is almost inevitable no matter what you do. But could it be stopped at 8.5 billion? Instead of 9.5, that makes a huge difference. 1 billion people, this is Washington, right? 1 billion is a number that even matters here after a while. So 1 billion people is a lot of, difference. Senator Tim Wirth, actually a good friend of environmental issues, he gave a talk that was absolutely brilliant. He had no slides, just walked to a whiteboard in front of a bunch of students and wrote down 2 numbers. He wrote down 8 and 2. And he said the best we can hope for, and this was a few years ago, the best we can possibly hope for is probably to limit population to 8 billion and only a world that's 2 degrees warmer than now. How are we going to make sure we only do that? Because so there is some inertia. So that's a big issue. And as I pointed out, population growth is part of the future demand and certainly a part that we need to work on. But the bigger one is going to be influence of diets and affluence. And unlike population, there is no stabilizing force for consumption. There is a demographic transition. Eventually, you can't grow your population anymore. Eventually, we all become like Japan. And we'll have, declining population and lots of old people and not enough young people, and worry about that problem later. But right now, we have the opposite one. But in wealth and affluence and consumption, there is no transition. The richer we are, the more rich we want to be. It just seems to be exponential forever so far. So that's the one that worries me at night, even more than population, and they're both pretty worrisome. So it's that kind of double nexus. And everything we can do, whether it's on population or consumption, helps. So I don't think it's either or, it's both and. But some of the population stuff, some of that horse is already out of the barn, but not all of it. Not all. And certainly focusing on young girls who are, especially there's 1 billion girls under the age of 18 right now in the world. 2 of them live in my house, by the way. But, but 650 million of them are living in households that earn under $2 a day. And focusing on those girls right now and getting them primary education, access to water, fuel, food, so they don't spend their whole days in drudgery and toil, can get an education. We all know, we've all seen this, this is the single most important thing we can do around population and human rights, not to mention the rights of many of these smallholder farmers are girls. So I think that's probably the most important thing we can do of all the things we talked about today is that so-called girl effect. It's hugely important. Jumping to another issue, maybe the phosphorus question. A gentleman in the middle asked about, there's been a lot of scary stuff written about peak phosphorus. Nobody in the phosphate industry believes that at all. Of course, you could say the oil industry never believed that either, and whether they're right or wrong about peak oil is a question still. But the best numbers I've seen actually seem to point out that the phosphate reserves in Western Sahara and Morocco alone could carry us at least 3 to 4 centuries into the future. Doesn't mean there isn't peak phosphate, it's just not 2030, maybe 2300. And that doesn't mean, oh, good, no worries. It means, oh my God, we still have a huge problem because we have no alternative. Oil, that's easy. We can always change to another energy source, at least in theory. Phosphate, it's in how we build amino acids and proteins that chemically cannot be substituted with any other element. So if you're out, you're out. But hopefully we can get good at phosphate recovery. It isn't so much as a source problem. I think it's still primarily a pollution problem. We're using too much phosphate. It's getting dumped in places where it interferes with aquatic ecosystems. And eventually we might hit that wall. Now, I'm not an expert on phosphate reserves, but I've been hearing a minority opinion of 2030, and people I think really do know this stuff, this phosphate futures people, and what's going on in Western Sahara and Morocco is, yeah, they're pretty confident they've got a few centuries. The real problem is as a geostrategic resource. More like oil than any other kind of any other kind of primary, absolutely essential ingredient we have for the world today. Phosphorus is basically in 4 places in the world: Florida, Western Sahara, and Morocco. Where else? I'm trying to think. China has some, and there's some in Indonesia. There's some actually under a kind of a native indigenous peoples reserve in Indonesia on one group of islands. And I remember somebody in the phosphate industry said, someday we're going to have to go after that phosphate. And did you ever see the movie Avatar? And I'm like, oh, God. He said, yeah, we're going to have to just wipe that out in this whole place and get that phosphate because there's only 4 major reserves on the planet. Who owns those in the future is going to be very, very, very interesting. So it isn't just the total amount, it's where they are, who controls them, what they're about. And just like oil, when it gets tighter, things get interesting. Could maybe be true with phosphorus. Anyway, something to watch, certainly. So I think that's a very important point. But it may not be so immediate, but it doesn't mean it's less important. I guess finally, what was the question? Maybe another question was about the spatial analysis that Iris brought up. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. It's actually something, I used to do a lot of that. Actually, we go to like agencies, but especially companies. We found a lot more kind of immediate traction with the private sector. And when I used to live in Minnesota, we were surrounded by a lot of food companies, for example. And so we go to them and say, hey, we could help analyze your supply chain. If we knew where you were getting your material from, we could put it into that GIS map and map out all of your growers and give you a ranking of which ones are really doing well, which ones are not. And this is where I kept on telling them, improving everybody a little bit isn't as effective as getting rid of the 10% that are the worst and leaving the other 90% alone, frankly. So that was something that was kind of eye-opening and very interesting. I'm kind of out of some of that business myself right now, but a lot of other people are doing that. There's actually some friends here from something called the Natural Capital Project that are doing a lot of great work in this area too. We collaborate with them a lot, and of course, they're doing a lot of work with companies and NGOs all over the world too. So I think that's probably one of the best resources in the world is a group like that. That's sort of a nonpartisan collaboration between NGOs and academics at Stanford, Minnesota, WWF, TNC, to put a little shout out to those folks. But there are a few others too that I think are doing really credible, good science that's getting peer reviewed and published, and making their data accessible and tools accessible to others to try to influence decisions on the ground, both in the public and private sector decision makers. So yeah, I appreciate the comment on that. It's good stuff.
John, I wondered whether you could talk a little bit about your plans for the academy. How do you see this sort of moving forward in the academy?
Good question.
Yeah. Well, those of you who know me wonder, like, what are you doing running a museum? My wife thinks I had my midlife crisis now. I probably should have just bought a Camaro or something. But it's no. I've been doing science for 20-something years now, primarily on climate change and then deforestation and now agriculture and other things. And I've been trying from that side of the street to see how do we communicate that science into the hands of folks who can use it. And so trying to be somewhere on that interface. And then I didn't look for that job. Actually, I turned it down the first time they were asking me about it. But then I realized maybe working the other side of the street of, how do you build a science convener and communicator that takes good, credible science that we do. We are also a research institute at the California Academy of Sciences. But also, how do we think much more about that interface of science and society? I think everyone in this room would agree, but not all of our colleagues in universities really are on board yet, saying that, this moment in history, we probably can't afford to have the luxury of just science done in isolation for its own curiosity's sake. Well, I think society should support that in the long haul. It's certainly a good thing, a long haul, but right now we need science to be engaged in a broader civic discourse, and soon, and now. And the kind of dumbing down of American discourse and the lack of good science entering that discourse is not something we can only blame on politicians and the media and everybody else. It's also the duty of scientists, I think, to be part of that solution. And so that's one of the reasons we moved there. And what I'm really excited about is the California Academy of Sciences. Those of you who don't know it, first of all, go. Next time you're in San Francisco, check it out. It's the most magnificent place you can go in San Francisco. It's right in the middle of Golden Gate Park, open every day of the year, and I'll tell you later more about it if you want. But it's a magnificent place because it used to be a kind of natural history museum, but then 6 years ago we reopened this magnificent new facility that's really a museum of sustainability and the environment. It has one of the largest living roofs on the planet. It has the only aquarium, rainforest, digital planetarium, and natural history museum all under one roof anywhere in the world. We house 45 million biological specimens, one of the largest collections not only on Earth, in history on Earth, and also we have incredible coral reefs and rainforest inside. So it's a really great place to exhibit what is going on with biodiversity in nature. And we engage between 1 million and 2 million people a year physically there every day, which is really, really exciting. So I find that to be an exciting platform to think about these issues and how we think about kind of a museum for sustainability. And our mission now is quite bold and quite exciting, is to explore, explain, and sustain life on Earth, which I can't think of a better mission.
And you're in a major agricultural state.
Yeah, California. Yeah, not so much Golden Gate Park,
Yeah.
but got a lot of food trucks, so it's good. But
Right? Yes, please. Yeah, so.
somebody.
Thank you. I'm Lisa Palmer. I'm a journalist and a public policy scholar here at the Wilson Center. And I've written for John's publication,
Yeah.
NCO.
Hi, Lisa.
So,
Nice to see
yeah. So I guess I wrote out this question before you were even talking, but maybe I was thinking ahead. But so how can a joint focus on where the future of food, climate, the environment, how can that joint focus become a multifaceted science and integrated into part of everyone's job at many levels of policymakers or economics, private sector, national security, energy business? Like, how can it become integrated the way maybe sustainability has become integrated into business, and the trays, like you were talking about with the tray issue at the colleges? How can just this overall food, climate, environment become integrated as part of everyone's everyday life?
Okay. Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Tom O'Keefe. I'm from the Foreign Service Institute. I'm also from California. And the question I have is has anyone been seriously talking about actually moving all this agriculture that's based in the Central Valley, which is almost exclusively or survives on irrigation? Has anybody been talking about taking advantage of this severe drought that we've had in the state of California now for more than 3 years and moving some of that agriculture to those areas that you showed in the map where there's food production or agricultural production, but it's focused on feeding animals?
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm Barbara Simmons. I'm Dean of International Education at William V.S. Tubman University in Liberia. Dr. Foley, I wonder in working to save the planet, have you given thought into how you might connect internationally? I had a conversation recently with the president of the Liberian engineers in the USA, and just before Ebola, they had worked with some of the government talking about establishing an Academy of Sciences in Liberia.
Oh, well.
Okay, thank you. Yes, in the back.
Hi, thank you. It's really interesting. Ruth Bell from the Wilson Center. I just wanted to build on the question about agriculture in California. I mean, there's a place where presumably there is governance, there are institutions. I'm curious, and I was raised in California and remember seeing those very wasteful irrigation systems when I was growing up in the Central Valleys. Can you just talk a little bit about whether this crisis has actually changed how agriculture is dealing with water issues?
Okay, great, thank you. So this joint focus that you talk about, how can we make this integrated approach more applicable more generally, sort of looking at agriculture in the Central Valley and the evaporation machines that you talk about, and then sort of connecting internationally.
Yeah, well, I'll go through this. Yeah, so this question about the Lisa presented about the joint focus on climate, agricultural, and food issues. Yeah, I mean, it's taking decades to get the concepts of like sustainability into public consciousness and climate change and others. Unfortunately, our public consciousness, at least on things that really matter, takes a long time. Now, if only about Kim Kardashian, it would just take a few weeks, so we'd be done. But this seems to take longer for more substantive matters. So I think we're on a long haul where we need to collaborate with people like yourself and others who can help share the narratives about what's going on in this field and make them accessible and powerful stories to tell, not just things that wonks and scientists like to hear about, because there'll just be rooms like this that have these conversations, and that's about it. We had a lot of fun working with National Geographic, actually, just down the street a little ways. They're doing an 8-month series on food issues, which is one of the biggest series they've done since like the Apollo mission, I think. So it's a big commitment on their part. And I knew Dennis Dimmick, who's behind it, spent like 3 or 4 years convincing Nat Geo to do that. And I was very fortunate to help write some of the first article, but there are many, many, many more that came out of that series and will continue to do so. So that's been really fun. I think that's raising a lot of discussion, and certainly the food movement, even if it's somewhat misdirected around, well, not misdirected, but it sort of latches onto kind of hot button issues and maybe needs to step back and look at the bigger landscape. And, Michael Pollan and others are great communicators of some of these issues. But, we love silver bullet, quick fix solutions. We love to debate. We love to argue about things. So I think that's where we get these debates about, GMOs get so heated, or about vegan diets and things. But maybe we could take a collective step back and look at some of the more substantive issues more generally. That'd be really helpful. But it seems to be hard for us to do. I wish I had an answer for that. If you find one, there's probably a nice shiny prize for you waiting in Stockholm. So I guess next question too is, was it Tom? Is it right? I'm sorry. I asked a question about in Central Valley. I don't want to sound flippant, but he said, "Well, has anybody thought seriously about moving agriculture from the Central Valley to somewhere else?" So, well, it'll sound flippant, and I don't mean it to be, but the answer is no. Period. I mean, the political interest and entrenched interest there are massive. We're talking about billions and billions and billions of dollars of interest. That isn't going to move. It'd be like asking New Orleans not to rebuild. It's just not going to happen. So right now, California has enough water for agriculture or nature or cities. Pick one. All three? No, not right now. Not the way we're using water. But the good news is, I guess, is that we are sometimes so inefficient with water that there's nowhere to go but better. And so the good news about being really bad is that you can improve. If you're already really good, you have nowhere to go. So it's good to be bad sometimes. Is that a song lyric? Anyway. Anyway, so the idea is, I think that, California will have to muddle through this. But the good news is, and it jumps to a later question about governance and issues in California. A lot of you know Governor Brown and the legislature of California just approved close to a $30 billion kind of bonding measure for many years into the future to invest in water infrastructure. And the good news is a lot of it is really focusing on like ecosystem services, thinking about how nature provides water if we lit it. And if we kind of reinvest in groundwater systems and efficiency, pumping, and so on. So actually, I was pretty impressed with that. I'm a relative newcomer to California, so I don't know the ins and outs of water politics. A lot of it's federal governance. It's not all managed by the state, that's for sure. Very little of it is, in fact, I imagine. But there is a major multi-billion-dollar investment, which is kind of astonishing. It's one of the biggest public investments in California in the last decades. It's huge, and it's going to matter a lot. And hopefully, how it's executed will be done very, very well. And then a wonderful question that you brought up about cooperation with other countries in this issue. Yeah, absolutely. Science has always been, even and maybe especially during the Cold War, it's one of the few things we could do with the Soviets, even people we weren't very friendly with, but certainly countries we are very friendly with. This would be fantastic opportunities for collaboration around these critical issues. So developing things like academies of science with others around the world who focus on other issues is really crucial. Love to talk to you offline about that if it can be helpful, and connecting you with some people. That'd be great. Here in Washington, though, as you know better than I do, the national academies would probably be the best place to start here in the U.S. of science, engineering, and medicine. But also places like Wilson Center and AAAS would be another place to start. American Association for Advancement of Science do considerable international work. We in California are a smaller outfit and by definition in some ways, but one that I think is, has a lot of interest in working internationally as well. So I'd be very interested in talking to you. We actually have considerable amount of field work going on in West Africa right now, in fact, despite the Ebola concerns. People are, we're still sending people back and forth, no problem. So it's good.
So, John, as you were responding to Lisa's question about sustainability, one of those other terms that we hear now, which is, very often considered a buzzword, is resilience. And sort of resilience in the context of learning to developing strategies and systems to respond to shocks and long-term stresses. What are your thoughts on this systems thinking behind resilience and how food and food security fits in?
Yeah, well, I think you said it very well. I mean, these unfortunately do become a bit of buzzwords because they become so popular overnight and everybody starts using them. But that tells you something, doesn't it? That maybe that's not a bad idea initially, as long as it doesn't get distorted into just people selling an idea rather than sharing an idea. So yeah, resilience, I don't think anyone in this room really needs a tutorial on that, but the idea that we need to build systems that are robust and can respond to perturbations as they get more and more frequent, if climate change plays out that way. But also, are we building more and more brittle systems? One of the lessons of resilience is quite interesting. In the name of kind of economic efficiency, we do things like, we don't like supply chains. We want just-in-time delivery. We don't want storage and warehouses. That's inefficient from an economics point of view. If you have to store food before somebody can eat it, what a waste. You should just ship it to them right on time. But actually, resilience thinking would tell you, no, you want inefficiency in the system because sometimes something might break, and the only thing that can pick it up is rapidly turning over what was inefficient into deployed instantly. So having reserves, stockpiles, multiple trade routes, that kind of thing, even if it's inefficient, actually is much more resilient. And so, and nature teaches us every day that, nature's completely resilient because it's diverse. We do everything as monocultures with efficiency and simplicity, and we're very brittle. One thing can bring it all down. So that's pretty disturbing when you think about how we build. The whole human economy, not to get too philosophical, but nature builds everything with zero waste, completely powered by renewable energy, constructed entirely at room temperature in a highly resilient and diverse system. We can't do any of that. You want to blow an engineer's mind, you just tell them that and watch their head explode.
That's great.
But it's true, and you just look outside and, or look in the average puddle of water and you see systems that are magnificently engineered that we can't even begin to duplicate yet.
Wow. I was quite taken with this story that you told about the tray on campus and the cafeteria on campus.
Yeah, it was weird.
And it was interesting to me that when you started talking about that, you said that the students had you all sign a sustainability pledge.
Yep.
This is a question I also have for you, Tom, because you interact with a number of college students. What are you both hearing from the American youth and from your students at college on these issues? Are students interested? Are they interested in looking for solutions? Do you see a lot of optimism there? What are both of your thoughts?
Well,
what are you hearing on campus?
So I actually, in the last 2 or 3 years, have seen a definite increase in student interest in all of this, and institutionally as well. It does help that we have a president at George Mason, Angel Cabrera, who's a major proponent of sustainability in management schools and business schools globally. But I think what I'm seeing in the students is almost independent of that. It's just like
Interesting.
Their eyes are opening.
Yeah, well, I've been teaching since like 1993, I guess, or something like that. So not that long, but 21 years, I suppose. And what was interesting in that short span of time, I've always seen a lot of students interested in environmental issues, but even through the early 90s, I think they were still in the model of maybe the kind of 70s style environmentalism, which is still great. It's wonderful, but it's kind of activism oriented. It's a bit somewhat confrontational. It's often distrustful of business, a little bit not great with technology, maybe like, and a little bit, that was sort of that's characterizing maybe very unfairly, but it was kind of a bit of the meme of, the torn blue jeans and the Birkenstocks. And I was teaching at Madison at the time, so you can just imagine, And So that was a lot of fun. But then starting in the early 2000s, all of a sudden I started noticing more and more of my students like were getting an MBA. And I'm like, what the hell? You know, before you didn't even want to go in the building. Now you're getting a degree there. And so more and more students are embracing the notion of kind of social entrepreneurship. And more of them are getting advanced degrees and saying, I'm not going into academia or government. I'm going maybe some international organizations perhaps, but a lot of them are starting NGOs or B Corps or their own companies or consultancies. And a lot of them, have a dream and an app, and they want to change the world. And that's pretty cool. It's maybe turning on different kinds of tools than the previous generation had. And I don't know what's better or worse, but it's interesting to see the change. But it's always heartening. But sometimes the trick is somewhere between their master's degree and their first mortgage is where you're really going to get people going. Because after that, well, it gets a little harder. And so that's the sweet spot that I try to work with people on the most, maybe.
Great. Thank you. I think we had some hands. Oh, wow. Lots of hands up. Great. Yes, let's start. I think you had your hand up earlier, please.
Hi, thank you very much for coming and talking with us about this. My name is Heather McLeod. I'm with NAFSA, Association of International Educators. Thank you very much for your comments. I'd love to talk to you later. But picking up on what you're talking about with college students, this is a very interdisciplinary problem. What work has been done or are you seeking to do with faculty in different departments across college campuses?
Thank you. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Reed Hamill. I'm also from UC Berkeley and Save the Children. So, Dr. Foley, you discussed earlier challenges to crop yields related to land and water scarcity. I'd really value hearing your thoughts on other vulnerabilities on the food production side, particularly as we see coming out of the Lobel Lab, vulnerability to increased temperatures, and also increases in pest and weed sort of resistant, Roundup Ready resistant, that type of thing. When we're focusing more on monocropping potentially to breed more drought-tolerant species, more high-temperature-tolerant species, what are your thoughts on balancing that with still some genetic diversity to avoid other types of vulnerabilities?
Thank you. Yes, gentleman in front here.
I'm Madhut Khan. Would you comment on the work that Dick McNider at University of Huntsville, Alabama has done on bringing back agriculture to the southeastern U.S.?
Okay, yes, lady in front here.
Hi, I'm Kathleen Mogelgard. I'm an independent consultant, and I do some work here at the Wilson Center. And I just had a quick comment as well as a question. I was really glad to see the discussion of population issues, and I'm always interested when the discussions of future food security include both a supply and a demand component. The population piece is one that does keep me awake a little bit at night. Especially when I think about, I've done some analysis of the focus countries of the U.S. Agency for International Development's Feed the Future program, and those are countries, many in sub-Saharan Africa, where the population projections continue to be revised upward because we're seeing these stalls in fertility. And I'm really interested and encouraged and feel hopeful about some of the really interesting integrated programs that we've seen that look at the totality of women's lives in particular, thinking about the girls' education component and how that relates to future fertility, but also looking at women's access to reproductive health care and family planning that help to contribute to those fertility declines that will help to keep population growth trajectories, hopefully toward the medium population projections that we see now, but we also know that they could go much higher than that, which would be a real challenge for food security in the future. My question is, I was really pleased to hear Melinda raise the issue of the Sustainable Development Goals or the post-2015 development goals that are underway, and I would love to hear your thoughts, Dr. Foley, on what you might suggest for targets or indicators that would help us really aim toward a more sustainable food security future. I was intrigued by what you said. Maybe we should be measuring mouths fed per hectare rather than bushels produced per hectare, and I would love to hear any other further thoughts or ideas that you have for how we could set development goals that would really push us in the right direction.
Great,
Thanks.
thank you. Yes?
Hi, I'm Lexi Schultz. I'm with the American Geophysical Union. You mentioned a number of areas where there are certain knowns that are built into the system. For example, the population increase, or at least the number of people alive. And I'm wondering where there are areas of inherent uncertainties. Where are some of the kind of key areas where the things that we just don't know right now that could make a big difference, either for the positive or perhaps for the negative? And if there's time, maybe how we move forward, understanding that we don't know some of these things.
Great, thank you. So looking at the interdisciplinary nature of these issues, what are you doing to engage faculty? Vulnerabilities on the production side, helping to bring back agriculture to Southeast United States, thinking about targets and indicators for the Sustainable Development Goals, and inherent uncertainties, a small set of questions.
Yeah, I feel like I'm a thesis defense or something. Well, I'll try to take a stab at some of these, and Stephen, I'd love for Tom and others to jump in as well, maybe see how we can do more conversation here. But getting to the first question about the interdisciplinarity and work that was mentioned, yeah, that's really crucial. I mean, you probably wouldn't guess, but my original training was in astrophysics. So, I mean, you find yourself where the problems are, not where your disciplines train you. And I would love to, I had a former university chancellor at Madison I worked under once had the brilliant idea that the best university would have exactly 26 departments. They'd be called A through Z. And they would have a coffee pot and a mailbox, and they would instantly dissolve every 5 years. We get too locked into our disciplinary habits and thinking that those matter, and they don't. No real world problem obeys the laws of university politics at all. I can't think of one that does. And so I'm really tired of disciplines fighting it out because they're totally irrelevant to the real world, and it's just we're fooling ourselves. So I find that, probably like yourself too, when you get people out of their university environment or a museum now where I'm working, and you focus on a real problem in a real place, solving real problems, it isn't. When I started at the University of Minnesota, they asked me to build an interdisciplinary institute, and I looked at the provost and said, oh, so you want me to build stairways inside the ivory tower to connect the floors together? And he said, oh, that's a perfect analogy. Yeah, that's exactly it. I want you to build the elevator in the ivory tower. And I'm like, I said, well, the problem is I want a bloody chainsaw, because what you really need are doors and windows. You got to get them out of the tower, and don't worry about the elevator. Get them outdoors. Think about going out and travel outside of academia altogether, and work with industry, government, media, NGOs, et cetera. And then that's the secret for universities to be more interdisciplinary, get them out of universities, period. That would help. Talk to normal people. It really helps. So that would be my 2 cents on that. Sorry about the soapbox, but you can tell I care about that a lot. I guess the second question was more about vulnerabilities to crop yields. I forget who asked that. I'm sorry. Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Yes, thank you. Yeah, you're absolutely right. You mentioned like David LaBelle, who's really kind of the world's leading thinker on climate perturbations affecting crop yields. His methods are showing, kind of extreme sensitivity to temperatures. Other methods are showing something similar, maybe a little more on the precipitation side. So I think the science still needs to be hashing out, but they're all showing, yep, climate matters. So that's going to be serious. And as we know a lot about climate change in that we're expecting a warmer planet in the whole, but where the rubber meets the road will be those individual weather events playing out day by day by day, where the dice are getting loaded more and more towards hotter extremes, maybe more extremes in the hydrologic cycle. What will that do to agriculture? That's still where we probably have more uncertainty. And combined with that isn't just weather changing, but also the simplification of agriculture, that we have more and more crops grown in giant monocultures in fewer and fewer locations. For example, I used to work a lot with General Mills, a company based in Minneapolis, makes Cheerios and a whole bunch of other things we all know and love, right? And they told me once that oats, they're the biggest purchaser of oats in the United States. They buy more oats than anybody. That oats used to come from about 12 countries in the world. Today it comes from 2. Canada and Ukraine, I think, were the 2. Huh? What happened? Even in Minnesota, why General Mills was there is because we grow a lot of oats, but biofuels, corn ethanol, pushed out all the oats. Nobody grows oats in the U.S. anymore. It's all turned into corn. So we've simplified into mega blocks of agriculture. Now think about that. You have let's say you have a mutual fund built of oats. Now you have 2 places instead of 12. One of those gets hit with bad weather. Now if you just took out 50% of it, boom, like that. So we've built a more brittle agricultural system. So not only is the climate changing, the geoeconomic, kind of supply chains have gotten too simplified and putting big fat targets in the way of weather and disease and pest. And as you pointed out too in your comments, you're absolutely right that the GMO folks told us this would never happen, but everybody who studies ecology knew that it would, that the bugs and the weeds are getting resistant to our GMO treatments, just as everybody knew it would. And so we're getting Roundup resistant kind of weeds, we're getting BT resistant insects out there, just as nature always does. And companies are now saying, oh, what we need now is another GMO. Like, can anybody say treadmill? What you should have done is have a diverse system and not done this in the first place, in my opinion. So I think that gets back to your question about resilience. We are being very efficient, not very resilient. And that's posing a big problem, I would argue. But, please.
Use the microphone, please.
Are we necessarily then talking about a trade-off with yield? So you
No.
you talked about sort of plateauing production, but more diversity. How do we maintain the yields?
There's no evidence that diverse agricultural systems are less productive than monocultures. They may be more labor intensive. So it's really an economic question. But the economics of agriculture are so distorted anyhow. What is economics in agriculture? Absent subsidies and price barriers and trade policies, there's no free market here. We just made a choice to favor certain systems that now favor monocultures. I don't know if that's a good argument. But it's sure as hell a good argument for more resilient agriculture the next time a famine comes or a major drought hits or something like that. I think then we'll be, that's maybe what we should have done. Mm-hmm. So hopefully we'll have the wisdom to maybe have some foresight about that. So maybe I'm sounding flippant, but I think, we can have high yields and diverse systems. Would it be the same economic systems we have now for agriculture? No, probably not. It probably doesn't lend itself to giant kind of large land holdings with large machinery systems and kind of more big agricultural solutions. It might be more diverse smallholders with different kinds of technologies, but it would still feed as many people, maybe more, and be much more resilient to, just do the math. Be like a mutual fund with one company's stock in it. Nobody in their right mind would do that. But with your retirement fund, but we'll do it the world's food supply. That's essentially what we're doing, is we're simplifying that food supply down to just a few major players, geographically, economically, even supply chains, and that's just dangerous. And then you add emerging diseases, weeds that are resistant to herbicides, insects resistant to insecticides, and then throw climate destabilization into the mix with more and more pressure on the food system. You kind of are writing the script for a really bad Jerry Bruckheimer movie. It's not where you want to go. So I think that's where, resilience is going to be part of this. And I didn't talk about that in my talk, but I'm glad you brought it up, because we have to build a resilient agricultural system and a sustainable one and a productive one and a fair one. It's a big challenge. But I'm really glad you asked that, because that's one of the most crucial parts of all this, is exactly your point. Gentleman over here, the question about southeastern U.S. agriculture. Right here. I'm not familiar with the study you're talking about, I guess. So I can't speak to that one study. Can you say a bit more?
Yeah, it was
You use the microphone.
Dick McNider and John Christie had written a couple of years ago in New York Times also an article that came out of the study that that there were smaller land holdings in the Southeast 100 years ago. There's enough water there, and so the subsidies that were given earlier in the century on the West Coast made those small farms go away, and so all those areas are now forested.
Yeah.
And so the sustainability of agriculture the viability of agriculture in the Southeast is in this changing environment is much more economically beneficial rather than continued subsidies to the West Coast.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. If you look at the history of U.S. agriculture, what you find is that after the Civil War, basically everywhere north of here, and in the Northeast, the big agricultural bread baskets of America until the Civil War were basically the Connecticut River Valley, Vermont, Massachusetts, Maine, the Hudson Valley River area, things like that. The kind of upper New England and upstate New York were the breadbasket of the country, and the Southeast for cotton and other kinds of cash crops and other things, of course, too. After the Civil War, the Northeast abandoned agriculture almost immediately, and those folks moved to the Middle West. and were, encouraged to do so in many different ways. But the economics of that time for the North were very different than the South. And so I grew up in Maine, and as a little kid, you'd run through the woods and stumble across these old stone foundations and rock walls with forests growing through them. All of New England is reforested. It was clear cut, and all in farms and pastures back in the 1870s. But the South didn't really abandon their agriculture until about the 1930s. It was much, much, much later. You see a totally separate history of agricultural abandonment. It was really the Dust Bowl era and the Depression where people left the land and moved to mainly the southern Great Plains and other regions where there's also a lot of problems, as you know. Some to California and other places too. So I think you're right. It's a really fascinating history. But now these places on the east are now reforested. It's the largest area of regrowing forest on the planet. That now has biodiversity of its own. Not the same, but it's some. It is habitat. It has carbon in it. So do we want to clear cut that again? Maybe we could do better. But there has to be some mix of maybe reusing some of the land we once used, if it's degraded still, but if it's in a nice, healthy forest, that could be a tricky one. I don't know. Very interesting question. And then, I'm sorry, there's a couple other questions here. I guess there's one about the
uncertainties.
Oh, yes. And there was another question or two about the goals and metrics related to when you asked about population issues and things like that. Well, I mentioned one that I kind of like it, and we measure. Sorry, this sounds again, I don't mean to be cheeky, but in the U.S., we're one of 3 countries in the world, and Liberia is one of the others, and Burma is the third, that still use bushels and acres. So we measure bushels per acre. We're one of 3 countries in the world that still use that system of measurement. So at least could we move to tons and hectares? That would be nice. Join the rest of the world. But instead of tons and bushels, could we measure like how many calories or how much nutrition, how much vitamin K or thiamine came off of hectare land that actually entered the human diet? When you see a cornfield, you can drive from Pennsylvania to Colorado and see almost nothing but corn. What is it? Is it food? Is it ethanol? Is it beef? Is it chicken? It could be plastic. Could have made this. You don't know. And unless you dig into the statistics, you don't know. I know it's a lot of bushels, but I don't know if it's a lot of food. So I like to think of it as kind of actually a colleague of mine who works in the Environmental Working Group, was a former student of mine, Emily Cassidy, first really did this analysis in a really brilliant paper looking at people fed per hectare, and that was some of the data I showed you was from her work. And so I like to look at not only people fed per hectare a certain kind of diet, but maybe nutrients per hectare, but also how much calories did we get per liter of water, or per ton of nitrogen applied, or per land carbon released along the way. Let's look at the good that agriculture provides nutrition, divided by the resources we had to use or the pollution we created in making that happen. So how much good did we get versus how much stuff did we have to invest or the harm we had to create? And if you wanted more of this and less of this. But right now you get bushels per acre. What do I do with that? I guess more is better, but not always. So I think it's really let's build metrics that explicitly look at the trade-off of agriculture against natural resources and environment, knowing we want nutrition, but we don't want environmental harm. So we need a whole different set of metrics in thinking about agriculture, I would argue. We're measuring the wrong thing. And lastly, the knowns versus unknowns from the AGU, right? I'm a member, by the way, hi. And so great organization. The knowns are always have, there's bounds of, there's, type 1, type 2, blah, 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 kind of errors in the Don Rumsfeld. We don't even know what we don't know kind of thing. But there's the always uncertainty in the things we do have a pretty good at least heuristic relationship between. We know a little bit about how climate affects crops and so on. Where the big surprises are, I think, I get back to these questions about resilience, might be like how will climate change play out alone is complicated in terms of the details, not the general pattern, but the details that will matter a lot, and we don't know them all yet. But even more importantly is how will that intersect with the economic systems, which will change even more over the coming decades, of simplification of agriculture, supply chains, where wealth will be, the native geopolitical affairs, the nature of those affairs over time, will there be increasing or decreasing tensions in different parts of the world, the rise of non-state actors, all these things that many of you study far more than I ever do. That's going to change even more than the climate will over the next coming decades, and how will those intertwine? It could be really, really surprising and quite interesting and scary. And then you have the wild cards of things like new pest diseases and things like this, social unrest, and also, hysteria. It seems to be more contagious than viruses in this country lately. And that in of itself has an economic impact too. I mean, imagine grounding airplanes during a crisis when you need to have more trade and help people. That's kind of weird. So I think we have to think very carefully about our response to crisis. And can we think through them carefully and not have knee-jerk political reactions, but sensible, factual reactions that actually try to help people and solve the problem? I mean, I think we can learn every time there's a disaster somewhere, but what's a good response, what isn't? And that seems to be the things that keep me up at night, is more those wild cards. We know they're inevitable somewhere along the way, just don't know when and how, but we can plan for them better than we are, I hope. I don't know, it makes a lot of sense. I don't know, you want to add something?
Any other final comments, Tom?
Only that I'm totally justified in having wanted John to come and talk.
Okay, well, thanks.
I think we had thank you, John. I think we had really a fantastic conversation today. I guess for me, there are three themes that I see come out of our discussion today. And I think I was quite intrigued as you sort of did your presentation and this came out in the discussion also. I sort of felt that we were talking about not just the future we want, but the future that we can have. Mm-hmm. You were very concretely talking about how agriculture is very often the elephant in the room, and you really pointed out that this really is a civilization problem, that we can move beyond these evaporation machines and a potential pro-food waste lobby, that there are ways to get beyond that, to get to human well-being and sustainability. I think you talked about that in terms of meeting needs and looking at dietary changes and sustainability. I think the second component for me was on the policy side. Mm-hmm. Sort of looking at what are these you talked about pulling these 5 levers in tandem, taking that to scale, recognizing globally there are hot spots that we could really be concentrating our energies. You said there's some places that matter most in thinking about how we get traction on these issues and thinking about how we match the governance tools that go with that, recognizing the social side of the equation, a very strong focus that came out in our discussion today. I think that was very enlightening. And then finally, thinking about where you are now, and your statement was at this moment in history, science cannot be in isolation, sort of reflecting back at breaking those norms in the ivory towers, getting out of the ivory tower, to your engagement with National Geographic and others, to thinking of the question on spatial representation and convincing others. So the importance of science, but also engaging others and going across disciplines. So thank you. It's been really a fascinating discussion, and just so wonderfully articulate on this wide range of issues with a lot of data and anecdotes and a really engaging conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you.